Okay, hello everyone. I was given the task of talking about how to get the most out of Diver Platform, how to optimize things so that users get the best performance they can in the time they expect to get it. I took this charge and basically assumed that for those of you that have been with us for a while, I'm doing Roger's tips and tricks. So I'm going to spend a few minutes each talking about a bunch of different topics. If you got questions, comments, thoughts, want me to go a little deeper on something, don't wait till the end. Hey Dan, can you? Just shout it out, that's fine. And I'll try not to run out of time. If I do, I don't promise to get to the last one. But these are the topics I'm going to hit. Every time I'm going to move on, you'll see this slide pop back up again. And if you don't want me to move on just yet, just shout it out. First one's actually pretty short. I just want to talk about Diver as a modular architecture, and this is something that really got a big boost with Workbench and projects. But if you look at how we describe the platform and how the pieces go together, we have this left to right flow beginning with data sources. We get the data out. We build this initial columnar data lake. No value add, no business rules yet. Just build the data lake, and then start value adding to that. ETL to build data sets. Governance and measure definitions to define a measure factory. And each of these is another step along the way. And with projects and Workbench, we try to keep this very modular. So all I'm trying to tell you here is build lots of projects and have a natural flow to them. You have data coming in from a number of different input sources. Have an extract project for each one of those input sources. As you add new sources over the years, add a new project. You start building some of the same things, and you'll have some similar information from different sources, and you'll be able to put it together in the next layer. Master data management, bring together common lookups, bring together common data from different sources into a single spot, and then you can start really applying business rules and business logic to come up with with your complex data sets, whether it's patient encounters or whether it's sales and inventory. And then finally, at the end, the measure factory can read back from any of those projects that it needs, the data sets for the transactions, the master data management for the lookups. So keep everything modular, natural beginning to end flow. And over time, new people come in, people leave. It'll be much, much easier to maintain this if you keep everything nicely segmented. So that's just a little quick hit, highly recommended. Be logical with your projects. Data and extraction and intake. When I start on a new project, new customer, new data set, haven't seen any of this before, I know that by the time we get down to the end of the road, it's got to be reasonably fast, but it's also got to be right. So I start by concentrating on it being right. If you start off with, hey, we have this extract that we use to populate some other system. Grand, that's a perfect place for us to start. Let's run that extract ourselves, get the data into Diver, take a look at the numbers, make sure everything adds up. We do that counts and amounts validation right off the top. If we can't come up with the sum of this column equals X and match what you get, then no measure we ever define off this data is going to work. So keep it simple there. And then we'll start to get more interesting once we get through that step. A lot of these initial queries that I get have got filters in them, and I always have pause when I see that, and I usually try to remove them, especially if they're removing about 1 to 2% of the data. If you have a filter that's throwing out an entire facility that you don't want us to look at, that's fine. I'll keep that. But I usually remove the filters and then bring them back in as part of the business rules, because I hate the idea of throwing away any data. 2 years from now, somebody's going to want to build a new measure, and it's going to need one of those records that you threw out in that initial filter, and it's going to take somebody a week to figure out why this account is missing because you had it in an initial query that somebody that doesn't work here anymore wrote 3 years ago. So I take out the filters up front, and I add them back in my business rules. So we get all that done. We start building out additional measures. It's like, okay, how do you define fall risk patients? Well, okay, the nurses do these things, and they fill out these forms in Meditech or whatever it is, and that data is captured, and we do a lot of joins over to that, and here's a SQL query we run that does that. It's slow, but it works. And we start getting a lot of these, and they start hitting a lot of the same tables. These specialized queries start getting repetitive, and that nursing documentation is definitely one that we hit a lot. It's about a 100 million row table, and I'm literally showing you all the columns in it. You got a patient, you got a date and a time, you got who entered it, what was the question, and what was the answer. And there's thousands and thousands of questions and all the different answers that have been captured for these questions over time. It's all highly customizable, changes over the years. And you got a lot of different things that rely on specific answers to specific questions. And while you might have a bunch of different specialized queries that hit and filter this data, those are going to add up. So I try to just pull this entire table and then work with it in Spectre. So it takes a while to pull it and load it into a CBase initially, but on an ongoing basis, we can do that incrementally. Just pull yesterday's data or this week's data, add it to the CBase. And if you've been doing any of this type of operation is probably the thing that's going to benefit most from Spectre in 7.2, because these incremental CBase builds, 90% of them is just writing the CBase back out to disk, and that gets a big boost in 7.2. So I think we'll actually be able to do these incremental queries even faster in 7.2. But that update takes some time once at the beginning of the night, but reusing this thing is easy. You've got the nursing interventions out. If you want to use those to define a measure, you do a lookup over to that or a link over to that, and just use that data quickly, and you don't have to run yet another slow SQL query. So yeah, these specialized queries get repetitive. And we take these large tables that get looked up too often, pull them separately, pull them incrementally, preferably using indexed dates in the source database. If there's an update date time, that's always great to use. But for something like nursing interventions, even the entry date is fine. Nobody goes back and changes that much more than a few days, so you can pull a relatively short window. And what you'll find once you've done a few of these is you're starting to build a data lake. Because all of a sudden, all this nursing documentation information is now sitting in a CBase that gets updated on a daily basis. You can open it in ProDiver and start looking around. So 3 years down the road, when hopefully you need to do something new with nursing documentation, no query exists, no one's written one yet, because you're going to Diver first, of course. The data's right there, ready for you to look at, figure out which queries you need, what are the possible answers, is this really bad free text? You can get all this information very quickly just playing around with the data in ProDiver. And once you have the data there, then you start building your data sets using Spectre for ETL rather than complicated SQL queries. So that's kind of my thought on strategies for extraction and intake. Thoughts, ideas, questions? All right, so the next thing I'll hit a little bit is measure factory scopes. And this is, while this is measure factory, there's a little bit of stuff in here that applies non-measure factory as well. So don't feel like you have to totally tune me out if you're not measure factory on this one. But what is a scope in measure factory? Measure factory keeps two types of transactional CBases available for use. They're data sets and they're scopes. Data sets are data sets. They're transactional data on some topic. Scopes take those data sets and align them so that we always add things up the right way when you build something off that scope. Classic example, if you look at the measures that I have here, the first and third lines are admissions and discharges. Those are both counts of patient encounters in a hospital. But admissions are when did they get there, and discharges are when did they leave. So in the month of July, your admissions are those patients with an admit date in July, and the discharges are those with a discharge date in July. So we take the same data set, but we create two scopes, admissions and discharges. Admissions aliases admit date to date, discharges aliases discharge date to date, and now everything knows what to do because factory always rolls things up on date. So admissions are going to do it right, discharges are going to do it right. Things that use those and other measures will have the right number for the month or the period of time that you're looking at. You can alias other things as well, but date is the big one that gets aliased all the time in scopes. So multiple scopes on a single data set are reasonably common, but people definitely go overboard on this. Every scope becomes a separate C-base. If you have a data set in 2 scopes, that's 3 C-bases basically out of the same data. Because the data sets don't get used as much as the scopes are really where I focus. But keep in the back of your mind that your memory requirement for a Spectre server is enough memory to hold all the C-bases, plus enough memory for the user queries to happen. So when I look at a factory and think about its requirements, I assume I need enough memory for the entire scopes folder, which is factory output internal views. We didn't rename it from views to scopes, but that's where all the scope C-bases are. However big that folder is, you need that much memory plus plus. So the more you can narrow that down, the more you can do with the memory that you have. So where aliases are used to align the data, like I talked about with admissions and discharges, you have to do that. Those 2 scopes are going to be necessary. But I see a lot of people do scopes that are just different ways of filtering the data too. And if you're doing that, you're basically creating redundant copies of the data. If you have the full data set, and then the last 2 years C-base, and then the previous 8 years C-base, that's just completely wasting disk. So anywhere I see filtered scopes, they're adding up to about 2 times or more the size of the input data set. I really start looking for ways to cut this down. You don't have to do the filtering in the scope, you can do it in the measure. This memory requirement applies to non-measure factory users as well. You need to have enough room in memory for all the C-bases that you use, and some of the same thinking applies. Where you have redundancy for convenience, you are at the same time causing people to look at different C-bases for the same data, and that involves both of them being in memory. So this memory thought process applies whether you're a factory or not. But for the factory example, here's a grossly oversimplified example of what I'm talking about. I've got a data set called orders. Everything that's ever been ordered is in this transactional data set. And when it ships, it gets a ship date. So I call shipments that subset of orders where ship date is not null. So I create a default orders scope, which is just the raw data, and one called shipments, which is the ones where ship date is not null. Open orders is where the ship date is null and order status is active. But each one of those things that I define as a scope is going to build a C-base. And people are going to be looking at those same transactions in different chunks of memory. I want them all looking at the same place. So here my measures are super simple. I'm just adding up extended amount, and those are going to produce different numbers because they're pointing at different scopes. In order to keep everything just on that one copy of the orders data, what I want to do is have just one orders scope, and I want to have the measures apply the filters. So orders is still just sum of extended amount. Sales is that with a filter for ship date not null. But that's going to look at the same transactions on the same chunk of disk and the same spot in memory, whether you're looking at it for orders or for sales. So you could do this now on a lot less memory. And you don't have to put that filter into every measure you ever build. If I want to build a measure for, let's say, on-premise sales, which is just the same thing as total sales with an extra hitch on the filter that says, and value of premise type equal on. I could do that by copying this entire measure and adding that to the filter. But the way I like to do that, and it keeps you more honest in terms of everything coming from the same place, is that on-premise sales should not do sum of value of extended amount. It should do measure total sales. You define something that's measure of total sales, and the filter is just premise type equal on. So you're building up the business rules piece by piece, but you always know that anytime you're doing something that's based on sales, you're referencing measure total sales somewhere in there. If it changes someday, you'll change it in one place and it'll fix it everywhere. But the key thing I want you to get out of this is I'm trying to keep the number of scopes down and make sure that if I got a year's worth of transactions, I only have it out there once if at all possible. Next, yeah. Yep.
I noticed that when I'm looking at a measure in a data set, sometimes the filter does not respect the measure in the data set. Is there a specific reason why that is, or
So yeah, in the factory, the question is about filters being applied, whether you open a data set. You're doing this out of the factory dive book?
Yes.
Yeah, so you open the factory dive book, you got data sets, and you got all measures. There's something I'd love to see us add to the dive book, which is scopes. When you look at the data set, you're looking at just the data set, not at the scope. So if the filter you're talking about is applied at the scope level, then right, the data set doesn't honor that. You can actually just go open the scope directly from the views folder, and that's usually what I do in those situations to see if that catches it. All measures is pulling together all the scopes at once, which means it is actually looking in the scopes folder. So all measures is opening none of the C-bases that are in that data sets category. There's an extra step in between that's probably getting missed there. So if the filter you're talking about is one that's at the scope level, then yeah, the data set's not going to pick it up.
The filter is on the measure. So like
It's on the measure.
it's on the measure, but when I open the data set, I would have to basically filter on that same measure in order for the filter to actually be applied to the measure. And that's a common thing that I'm seeing.
I'm trying to think. I don't recall if do you actually have the measures in the data set, or do you just have the rules? Okay. That's interesting. I'll have to look at the specific case, which I'm happy to do right after this. Yeah, like I'm used to that from the scope filters, but the measures surprise me. If you add the measure as a summary column, I would expect it to apply. Yeah, I'll have to take a look. All right, so I'm going to roll on with invalid data, also known as the infamous unknown. Unknowns are a lovely little thing in Spectre that has a habit of breaking dives or making things come up blank when you don't expect them to. But they're there for an important reason, and that's because we can't always read and properly process the data that you send us. So you get an unknown when we can't produce a value out of what we get. You put letters in a numeric column. You put an invalid date in a date column. You do invalid math, like divide by 0. We can't produce a correct answer for the slot that we have for it. So we put in this thing called unknown. It's a special value. It's not just the string bracket unknown close bracket. It's a special value within Spectre, and it explicitly by design breaks math, breaks date roll, it breaks everything. You try to add 1 plus unknown. If you don't know what unknown is, then we can't know what adding 1 to it is. So all of this stuff is, once you get that unknown in there, if you have a single unknown in a numeric column, then your grand total for the C-base for that column is going to be unknown. And you're going to get blanks that show up on a lot of dashboards. So depending on how much you trust the data that's coming in, you really might have to do some work to make sure that these unknowns don't creep their way in. They also break date rollup. If you have one invalid date, we can't tell you what year to date is because we don't know if that invalid date was supposed to be in year to date or not. So we don't know the answer, so we refuse to tell you anything. So when these unknowns come in, you explicitly have to decide what to do with them. So in inputs, you can, if you're finding them and don't know where they're coming from, read the column in a second time as a string. Then find the unknowns and look at the string and see what was in there. You'll usually figure out what's going on. If everything is unknown, you almost certainly have either a date format that's wrong, it's YYYY-MM-DD, and you told it to parse it as MM/DD/YYYY. That one happens all the time. With numeric, if you read it from Excel and there's $ on every row, that's not a number. So that's stuff that's easy to deal with. You can write calcs that are going to correct for that, or you could fix your parsing. Sometimes they're just genuinely bad data. And you have to decide what you want to do with genuinely bad data. You can null it out or zero it. You could filter it out, throw it into a C-base somewhere that someone has to look at, but that data is not coming until it gets fixed. You can do additional processing or reporting to deal with this stuff. Maybe try to remove certain special characters, remove the commas, when I get financial data, I have to remove the parentheses and turn the left parentheses into a minus. So stuff like that you could do to get rid of the unknowns. But genuinely bad data, you have to decide what you want to do with. And that really comes down to, do you trust your data sources? If your data source is something that is written by a person, and I mean an Excel spreadsheet here, you probably want to do something about bad data. In measure definitions or in calculations, you can use the catch function to deal with this. Catch is a function that says, after you do this thing, if the answer is unknown, instead put in this other value. So I do stuff frequently where I have, give me actual divided by budget, and then I just wrap that in a catch, comma, 0, so that if there is no budget and I'm dividing by 0, I just put a 0 up. Yeah. Column blah is a string, type equals string. I'm talking about reading from text here, so you just specify the column. I guess you probably can't read the same column twice. That's probably true. You can't read the same column twice. So I read it as a string, and from data sources I don't trust. I'll read in my numeric columns as strings and then turn them into numbers with parse double or parse integer or parse fixed with a catch around it. But then you have to keep both, so that where the catch will return invalid data or something, and then you have to be able to dive on the underlying strings.
The reason why I'm asking is because I was trying to do this on the movie, but you cannot do it unless you do a calculation, as far as what I found.
Well, you can.
You have to do it in the code.
No, you can tell it what type you want a column to be, can't you?
I'll have to show it to you.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think the real catch is you can't read the same column twice. And that's what I really want to do. So I read it once as a string and write a calc to parse it into the second thing. If the data is coming from a SQL Server database via ODBC and the column you're reading is a numeric, just read it as a double and you're fine, and don't worry about it too much. If it's anything a human is typing into, run away, fear. But yeah, when you do those first builds and your total rows all come out blank, it's time to go looking for unknowns. All right, Quickviews, a little bit on Quickviews. Quickviews are there to specify filters to be applied to page content. You pick a value, page gets filtered down to that. And when your Quickviews are facility or department or supplier, that's grand. When your filters are things like patient ID or invoice number, and you've got giant numbers of values in these Quickviews, things can grind to a halt in a hurry. Searchable Quickviews make it easy to access one of many values, so it's tempting to throw that up there because I could just type in a name and get there quickly. But that really will slow down the page. So when I'm building something interactive for users, and I want to put something like that on a page, I try to put in some mandatory higher level selections that they have to do first. So let's see if I've been timed out of my session yet here. Let's see. So I have here a page where you can look at, and I left my demo in bad shape. I have a page here where you could bring up, where you could look at, oh, ha, thank you. Can I do that? Now it just completely hung. There we go. Oh, well, the only reason it completely hung is because it completely hung because I'm loading a page with a quick view with 1 million values in it. And I did this just, you got this page with 1 million values in it, and it takes a little time to load up. And I could click on that, and I could search for a name, and like seriously, my browser is genuinely hanging trying to do this. Hit what? Oh, yeah. Why? Just because there's all that white space? Like literally every time I hit a key, it takes about a second to show up on screen. But I'm not looking for me. I'm going to look for Fred. But somewhere in here, I'm going to find some Fred powers. And I can click on that. And it'll narrow down the screen. And I'm bringing back one record here. This is bringing back one record. And this is because I have this million value quick view on the page. There's lots of JavaScript running. The browser is not liking this. It's trying to load that whole table. Don't do this. So if I go to come on, page. Oh, I've got a red exclamation point. I've killed it. I've killed it. There we go. See if I can get over here without. This really is a bad idea to do this. I should never create a demo to show you how not to do something. But okay, now we're on the know all values page. And this is, yes, I'm going to have to go through two steps. I'm going to have to go to last name first, narrow that down, go to patient, narrow that down, and back it comes. So I injected an extra step there, but in doing so, that patient pull down never tries to load a million values all at once. And you really have to divide and conquer a lot to get these quick views to perform nicely. Yeah.
The first quick view, well, did the second quick view have to, like, is it linked?
The second quick view is definitely dependent on the first. This is actually a Spectre quick view set, so the quick views are naturally dependent from top to bottom when listed in a Spectre quick view set. And Rose is telling me I'm out of time, which means I'm going to ignore her and go to the last topic. But I'll be quick about it. Actually, one other thing on quick views and pop-up detail pages. Quick views can actually get populated in two ways. Of course, you could click on it and pick a value. But quick views also get populated when you navigate to a page via a click action. So sometimes you just have a quick view that's there to receive a value. And you can't make the user pick something extra first because they just clicked on a value and navigated to this page. So lately we've taken to using ProDiver markers to back these pages because ProDiver has this lovely thing called a free entry quick view, which is just a blank space where you can put whatever value you want. Well, that's glorious if you're coming through in a click action because DivePort will just put a value right in there for you, and it doesn't have to load a million values. It only takes the one you've got. We stumbled onto this a couple of weeks ago. At some point, you will get free entry quick views in DivePort. They're not there yet, but you can do it right now in markers. So what we were trying to do was create a central page, a DivePort central page for a patient, so you could click on a patient ID and get back a page with like 12 portlets on it showing all kinds of detail. It was just too slow. So we started playing with free entry quick views. The last topic is caching, and Rose, I really will hold this to like quick. Say again?
We're going to just make it up and have a shorter break.
Oh, okay. So Spectre caches every dive you do. You do a dive, it calculates the results, and it writes it to disk. And until you rebuild the underlying C bases, those results are cached, and Spectre won't even do the work the next time it gets asked. Once the C base builds, those entries become stale, and the first time somebody tries to do it again, they'll have to wait. So a Spectre cache refresh will tell Spectre to go back through the cache, find all those things that people have done before, and just replay them. So that the entries become fresh and pages load faster. This is great for things that take some real time to run. Your primary dashboard pages come up nice and quick. But you got to clean up after yourself. You want to delete entries that are outdated. Spectre's a little bit clever about entries that work on current date. It actually knows that that's current date rather than the specific date that was selected, so the same cache entry will keep working. But there's a lot of stuff out there that gets done once and never done again, or you change a DivePort page. And so the old query will never get done again, but that entry will still keep getting replayed. So there are ways you can get the Spectre cache to refresh more intelligently. What inevitably happens is brand new site, no active users yet, we're just about to go live. We have a production process, and at the end of the production process, you say refresh the cache. And you go through all your testing, and that cache refresh step takes about 5 minutes to run because you have no users and nobody's really done anything yet. And you come back 3 months later, and 100 people have been in, and they make a bunch of Quickview selections. All of a sudden, your Spectre cache refresh is taking an hour, 2 hours. You come back a year later, your Spectre cache refresh is taking 14 hours and starts to run into tomorrow's build. And you really can cut this stuff down. You could specify that the cache runs only on certain types of queries. And this, I apologize, the type is probably pretty small. The good news, it's just a screenshot of our documentation, so I recommend reading it. But this is the section on refresh with predicate, which says, I only want to refresh certain entries. It is amazing how much time you can save if you just tell it to only refresh anything that takes more than half a second to run. Because inevitably there are tens of thousands of things out there that are Quickview population, things that run in about 1/10 of a second, and 50,000 times 1/10 of a second is almost an hour and a half. And you can just cut that right off the build. And the longer that, so, the last bullet point here, and it is the last bullet point of the presentation, check in on your cache refresh periodically. Once it starts getting longer than a couple of hours, once it starts running past 9 in the morning, start looking at ways to cut it down. And that is, number one, time to generate. You want things that are actually taking real time to generate that users are waiting for. And you want num hits and idle. Are two that I use often. Num hits is how many times has this cache entry been used in the real world, and idle is how long has it been since this cache entry got used in the real world. An entry that hasn't been used in about 6 weeks is probably dead. But there's a lot of entries out there that get used like in a big burst right at the beginning of the month, and then nobody looks at them again for a month. So I usually try to do 6 weeks if I can get away with it. But this is definitely one of those ongoing care and feeding things where you want to make sure your cache refreshes are not going overboard, because there's a lot of stuff there that can be cut out. And that is the end of that. Any other questions, or back to you, Levin? Yeah.
Is there a way to run, you have one big C base, and that's, a lot of cache.
No. You want me to only run the entries that hit that one C base.
Cache refresh kind of at the same time. So like I do my builds, middle of the night, I have no users, so there's no one else on the server, so I can run
You can run a big one.
twice at the same time. And just kind of run one with predicate on my big, 10-year sales C base, and then all the other supplemental data sets.
Unfortunately, none of those predicates have anything to do with what's in the query itself. But if you have a big, can you run 2 Spectre cache refreshes at once? The problem is, I'm not surprised. So the Spectre cache refresh first looks to see what's stale, and then says, okay, I got a list, I'm running them. So some of that stuff is going to have been fixed, or the other one will be working on it, but I guarantee you the second one will catch the first one. No.
So do you ever like sweep your cache to keep it lower again? I run the nightly, but I kind of apply this to my build, try to have clear real-time data. You can build every 15 minutes, and I very much like to kind of stack my cache refreshes every 15 minutes.
Well, so the good news is the every 15-minute runs are not going to rebuild the big 10-year C-base. So the 10-year C-base stuff isn't going to go stale on those builds. I also, one of the things I do in some of my scripts is I'll have a conditional that says, is it before or after 4 a.m.? If it's before 4 a.m., run this fairly permissive cache refresh that does a lot of things. If it's after 4 a.m., I really only want to hit the most important stuff. So it's the stuff where time to generate is longer than 5 seconds or 10 seconds, and idle is fairly low, and number of hits is above 3. I mean, it really doesn't have to be a very big number to start filtering things out. But I try to get the day cache node down to like 10 minutes. And it actually really does make a difference. It's like when you go to the pages you just know are slow, they're there. But yeah, I kind of count on the fact that it's that big C-base that's going to be the nightly one, and I just try to like start the night cache after everything is finished, because you really can't control the cache based on the presence or absence of some particular thing in the query.
Would you be able to loop it on users if you got a list from?
You actually can. User is one of the attributes.
It was the first user used to create the dive, so that's not
Point.
we actually use it after, so that's not reliable.
Excellent point. Yeah, it's the user. It's the user that was logged in at the time the cache entry was created. It comes in handy if you've got 100 users and 100 different access control setups, because every one of those is a distinct dive, and the access control restrictions are stored as part of the cache entry. So yes, it is possible to run cache refreshes only for specific users, but the ones you really want to run it for, it probably won't do much good for, because they're the ones that have access to everything.
I was thinking using that as a parameter list and running 2 or 3 at one time.
You could. I think from a practical standpoint, I don't think it would get you your 10 gig C-base out of there, but maybe. You'd probably have to run it for like every user that could hit that.